So let's think about some of the biggest trades in recent NBA history and try and figure out what a lot of these have in common. For example, Kyrie to the Celtics was an incredibly impactful trade for a lot of different reasons. And although it's been largely unsuccessful, you can say the same thing for Paul George to the Clippers. And of course, Anthony Davis being traded to the Lakers led directly to LA winning a title. And you have the James Harden trades to both the Nets and the Sixers, which I think is going to have a big impact on what the league looks like from a rules standpoint over the next decade or so. But again, think about the similarities between those deals and a lot of the other big time NBA trades that happen, the trades that we are eagerly anticipating that everybody talks about. It's one of the best things about the league. The thing that a lot of those have in common is these are older, established players. They're late 20s, early 30s. A lot of times guys haven't won a title yet, or they're actively chasing just a better situation for themselves from a team perspective. And I bring that up because right now there's a situation developing in Atlanta that could set a completely new precedent in terms of what a big time NBA trade looks like. I think there's a real possibility that before this trade deadline or in this upcoming offseason, we see Trae Young on a new basketball team. And that would be a wild development for a player that, in contrast to those deals I talked about in the intro, is just 24 years old. He's a multiple time All-Star. He's made an All-NBA team. He just signed a max that couldn't turn into a Supermax extension with Atlanta. And already there's the possibility that this guy's not going to be on the team in 9 months. And this is particularly interesting, one, because Trae Young is a pretty polarizing player. Those of you guys that have watched my videos for a while understand kind of where I stand on Trae as a player and his impact on winning games. But also, this would, like I said, this would set a new precedent. This would be a new thing. This would be something that we had never seen before in terms of a player this young and this established being traded immediately off of his team. So let's talk about what is going wrong here in Atlanta, because there's two sides to this. Because typically when we see trade rumors like this, it refers to the player being unhappy in his situation. When you think about all those things that I mentioned in the intro, whether it's they really want to play with another guy, they want to play with another team, or their team is just not as successful as they want it to be, they want out and they request the trade. And there does seem to be some of that here for Trae Young. Going back to even his second year in the league, he was asking the Hawks to add players to the roster, to continue to improve the roster around him. He wanted to win more games. He wanted to be more successful. And Atlanta has tried to do that. They've tried to put a team around him that works. They've paid guys like John Collins big money. They traded all these picks away in exchange for DeJounte Murray. There has seemed to be an urgency in terms of how they want to build their roster, but with the exception of the one run to the conference finals, there hasn't been that much success here in Atlanta since they drafted Trae Young, and since they have in a lot of ways heavily invested in trying to be a better basketball team. But the interesting thing about this, and again, the thing that makes this a little bit different, is there's a little bit of stuff on the other side of this as well. Like, we always have the player that's unhappy, but the team doesn't appear to be particularly happy about Trae Young as the center point of the team either. Now, I'm sure if they could pick, they would rather keep Trae Young. They'd rather everybody be happy and just be successful and build around him, but they don't seem to be apprehensive about looking into possible deals in exchange for Trae Young, if you're believing a lot of the rumors and a lot of the reports. And there's a variety of different reasons for that. There have been multiple reports and indications that maybe Young views himself as like a little bit above the team, whether it be, flying back privately by himself or just kind of keeping himself a little bit separate from the rest of the group, maybe not being the best leader. And then, of course, on the floor, he's the worst defensive player in the league. He just is. He's small, he gives no effort, and it's just really tough to build a championship level team around that, despite how great he is offensively. And let's be clear, Trae Young is an outstanding offensive player. Like, there have been issues at certain points in his career in terms of he has too much of the ball or he's not efficient enough, whatever the case may be. But when you go back and look at some of the offensive ratings of these Atlanta teams over the past couple of seasons and what Trae's had around him in Atlanta, he is an outstanding focal point offensive player. He's an incredible passer. He obviously can shoot the ball. He can get to the rim. Great at getting to the free throw line. Credit where credit is due there. But it's interesting when you have a situation like this where Atlanta is like, yeah, we would maybe trade Trae Young, because typically it's only from the player. For example, things that we've seen like this in the past, a little bit similarly to this, would be like when Devin Booker was really unhappy in Phoenix, right? He was a guy that was an all-star caliber player, 24, 25 years old. We didn't really know where Phoenix was going prior to the Chris Paul trade, prior to the bubble when they really stepped it up and started to improve their roster. And we were all looking around thinking that Devin Booker's time in Phoenix is very limited. There were a lot of rumors about maybe he's unhappy there, and Phoenix would have been really happy to keep him, and that's the difference between here and Trae Young. But we've seen like younger players, rumors kind of swirl like this. Same thing with Karl Anthony Towns, and maybe we'll see that continue, into the future. But there were rumors for years about the fact that Minnesota couldn't put a good enough team around him, how he was this incredible offensive talent they couldn't guard, and they couldn't put a good enough team around him, and he potentially wanted to leave. The difference is this feels way more legitimate, because I think both sides potentially see an out here. I think Trae might want to leave Atlanta, and I don't think Atlanta would be necessarily upset if they were were able to kind of reset their team just a little bit here. Now, of course, given the fact that they just invested all this stuff into DeJounte Murray and they have all these future picks that they owe, it would be insane to consider trading away Trae Young without an absolutely massive haul in exchange. But I'm just saying that, like, typically when this kind of stuff happens, there's a lot of pushback from the team. There's a lot of, oh, we're not trading him, we're not trading him, we're not trading him. There hasn't been that kind of a feel around Atlanta, and that's what really piques my interest about this. And so then I started to look and I was like, okay, other than Karl Anthony Towns, other than Devin Booker, like, what trades have we actually seen go through that are at least minorly similar to what we have here in Atlanta, where a guy is, under 25 years old, one of the best players at his position, has made an All-NBA team or gotten close to it, and has been traded. One of the first things that came to mind, it's not close, but like SGA, when he went to Oklahoma City after just his rookie season, he ultimately becomes an All-NBA player. He's probably going to make first-team All-NBA this year. We didn't know that at the time that he got sent to Oklahoma City. Oklahoma City obviously really liked him as a prospect. They weren't doing the Paul George trade without him, but that's one that kind of comes to mind in terms of a really young player that ends up being really good, but of course, his accomplishments and his accolades in the league were not where Trae's are right now. One of the other ones would be the James Harden trade to Houston. Again, he wasn't an All-NBA caliber player or anything, but he becomes an MVP player in Houston, still a very young guy, and Oklahoma City trades him away despite the potential and the upside that he had. But again, that was more of a contract dispute thing than anything else, not really Harden wanting to leave, although I do think there's some similarities in the fact that OKC was certainly willing to deal Harden, kind of similar to this Trae Young situation. And then the last one would be Brandon Ingram going from LA to New Orleans as a part of the Anthony Davis trade. Again, not shown to be an all-star caliber player to that point in his career. And of course, Trae Young has made an All-NBA team, made a conference final. So none of those three are really great examples. But there is one, and we saw it just this past offseason. The Donovan Mitchell trade from Utah to Cleveland, I think, is the closest comparison that we have here, where maybe the player is a little bit unhappy and maybe the team is like, we could possibly trade this guy away. Like, it's not an absolute no to trade away Donovan Mitchell. Of course, it ended up not being. They trade away Rudy Gobert, they trade away Mitchell, they got all these picks. The difference here being that Atlanta is heavily invested in trying to be good with this team by trading away future firsts in exchange for DeJounte Murray. But that's the similarity to me. Similar age, similar accomplishments in the league, a general willingness from both the player and the team to both move on to a different situation. And we've seen how that trade has impacted both Cleveland and Utah. Now, Utah has made some other moves that, of course, have really helped them as well, but both teams absolutely came out as winners in that deal, and specifically Cleveland, the team getting the guy that maybe was a little bit of a weird fit in a different situation, or people thought he was inefficient, or they had all these, issues with Donovan Mitchell, has fit in absolutely perfectly in Cleveland. Like, if you were just to reverse this and say, obviously it's not an ideal fit because Darius Garland and Trae Young, like, size-wise, it's not ideal, right? But if you were just to say, okay, you put Trae Young in that spot where Donovan Mitchell is, and you basically do the Donovan Mitchell trade, but you reverse it, and Trae Young ends up in Cleveland, I bet they'd be having a really successful season as well, as an incredible distributor, playmaker, and shooter, and the defense behind him as well. Here's the difference, though. You can talk all you want to about how bad of a defender Trae Young is and lack of effort and all that stuff. There's no world, there's just zero scenario in which, no matter how much effort Trae Young puts in defensively, that he could ever be as good of a defender as Donovan Mitchell could be and can be. And I know that he had his issues in Utah and he was not putting in any effort, and I get that, but Donovan Mitchell is significantly bigger and has significantly more length, and that to me is a huge difference in terms of like their relative situations. Like, yes, Trae Young needs a strong defensive infrastructure, but Donovan Mitchell can at least be an average defender with high level effort, and potentially way better than that if he really wanted to. I don't think there's any way, even if Trae Young put in maximum effort on every possession, he could be anything better than like slightly below average defensively, and that's a huge difference. But specifically, as we're talking about these Trae Young rumors, like that's the comparison, that's the example that I keep coming back to. Whether it happens or not, that kind of structure, I think, is what we would be looking at in terms of a situation that Trae Young could potentially go to and see success with. Because these big market teams, like either LA team, Miami, they don't have the assets to make this work. Like, it's just impossible. They don't have the future first round picks to trade that Atlanta would want. Like, Atlanta just signed this guy to a Supermax extension. They're going to want every draft pick you can possibly trade. Those three teams are out of it. They can't do it. It would have to be a team, in my mind, maybe like Memphis isn't a great example, but you understand what I'm saying in terms of a team like Cleveland that has these assets, has these players Trae Young fits around, and they can give up all these future first round picks. So like New Orleans would be an option. Memphis, as I mentioned, just in terms of assets. But what about the New York Knicks? Now, I understand it's a little bit weird because they just got Jalen Brunson. Jalen Brunson is an all-star caliber player for them right now. But like, if you could do, RJ Barrett and all of the firsts and try and figure out something defensively between Brunson and Trae Young, I think that would be an interesting situation. But that is where this leads me. If we put all this together, we think about the precedent that this would set and how weird of a situation it would be for Trae Young to get traded, what is his value? value, because initially you'd think everything you could possibly trade. Trae Young is one of the better offensive players in the entire league. He's an all NBA caliber guy. He's 24, 25 years old, whatever the case may be. Here's the thing though. I think if you really got into it, let's just say it tomorrow, Atlanta's like, we're trading Trae Young. Put in your best offers. We're trading him by the trade deadline. I think we'd be a little surprised at how low some of those offers would be. It wouldn't be completely at the floor, but I think the value would be like maybe right at what the Mitchell trade was, maybe slightly above what the Mitchell trade was. And as it turns out, Cleveland traded away an all-star Lauri Markkanen in addition to all those first-round picks. But like, I don't think it would be like an Anthony Davis level return in exchange for Trae Young. One, because those bigger market teams don't have all those firsts, with the exception of the Knicks. And two, like, the defense stuff is a big issue. And if you trade for Trae Young, like, your entire team has to be built around him. That wasn't necessarily the case for Donovan Mitchell. That wasn't necessarily the case for Anthony Davis. Like, these guys were versatile and had a lot of different ways in which they could play. If you trade for Trae Young, he is your team. Like, he is everything that you do on every single possession, both ends of the floor. And I think that limits his value a little bit. And so it's such a weird and interesting situation. I personally would like to see him in a new place with a little bit better defensive structure and a team that maybe has a little bit more resources to build around him, because whatever they've attempted to build in Atlanta just has not worked out. But it is going to continually be this really interesting storyline over the next, couple of weeks as we lead towards the trade deadline, and then of course into the offseason as well. If they don't even make the playoffs and then Nate McMillan leaves and they're looking at an entirely new setup here next year, a Trae Young trade I think is a pretty realistic possibility.